It all began with a thick envelope, one that felt far heavier than its size should allow. When it landed on my desk with a soft thud, I barely gave it a glance at first. The morning had already been a mess, a half-spilled coffee, a flurry of emails, and a forgotten conference call. I shuffled the papers aside, saving the envelope for later. But the universe has a cruel sense of humor. That envelope was not meant to be ignored. Hours passed before I finally slid it open. Inside was a neatly printed contract, the sale of my house. My house. My name stood there in official black ink, listed as the seller, yet I had never signed anything. Confusion clouded my thoughts as I flipped through the pages. It didn't take long for confusion to turn to dread as I noticed the buyer's offer, the closing date, and, most importantly, the forged version of my signature at the bottom. Someone had tried to copy it, badly. I sat frozen, staring at familiar handwriting. I'd seen that signet. You're 1,000 times, on rent checks, birthday cards, and love notes. But there was nothing loving about this. My pulse quickened as reality sank in. Sarah had somehow tried to sell my house, the place I'd inherited from my parents, without me knowing. A wave of nausea swelled in my stomach. I could hear her humming softly in the kitchen downstairs. The sound grated on my nerves now, sharp and infuriating. My hands shook as I stood up, the contract clenched tightly in my fist. I stormed down the stairs, each step fueled by an ever-growing anger. She turned to greet me, holding a mug of tea with that disarming smile of hers, as if the universe hadn't just shattered around me. I'll never forget the way her expression changed when she saw the papers in my hands. There was no need for yelling. My silence alone said everything. Her face went pale, the color draining as though someone had opened a faucet. At first, she tried to deny it. Her voice wavered, her hands fumbling to take the papers from me as if tearing them up would erase the betrayal. But it didn't take long for denial to crumble into sobbing confessions. She admitted everything, she had tried to sell the house. Worse, she'd been planning it for weeks. Sarah's parents, it turned out, were in trouble. They were drowning in debt and about to lose their family home. She told me she'd grown up there, that it was the only place that felt like home to her, and she couldn't bear to see it taken away. That's why she wanted the money, to save their house. I remember standing there, stunned as her words poured out like a confession in church. She painted herself as the victim, as someone with no choice, but all I could hear was the sound of my trust shattering into 1,000 pieces. I should have seen it coming. Little red flags flickered in my memory, how she had been unusually quiet whenever I mentioned bills or paperwork, how she'd brushed off conversations about money or acted overly cheerful to deflect my questions. My house, my parents' legacy, had been nothing but a safety net to her. The realization burned through me, hollowing me out. The anger boiled over. I told her it was over. I don't even remember the exact words I used, but they were cold and final. Sarah collapsed into tears, begging me to understand, but there was no coming back from this. How could I ever look at her the same way? She wasn't the woman I thought I was going to marry. I felt stupid, a fool who had trusted too much, who had let love blind him to the truth. I demanded she leave the house immediately. At first, she refused, clinging to the idea that we could talk things out, or fix this. Her words fell on deaf ears. The Sarah I knew, the woman I'd planned to spend the rest of my life with, was gone. All that remained was a stranger who thought she could manipulate her way out of the mess she'd created. When I handed her a bag and told her to pack her things, she knew I wasn't bluffing. Watching her move through the house, and gather her belongings was surreal. Every photo frame, every piece of clothing she touched, felt like an invasion. This was my space, my refuge, and yet she'd made it her own over time. Now, every reminder of her felt tainted. She cried the whole time, whispering apologies that only made me angrier. Her tears weren't for me, they were for herself, for getting caught, for losing the security she thought she had. Once the door finally shut behind her, the house fell silent. It was the kind of silence that feels loud, heavy with things unsaid and memories that still linger in the air. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty space where she'd been moments before. It hit me then, how quickly everything can fall apart. Love, trust, and plans for the future can vanish in an instant, leaving nothing but echoes of what could have been. I sat on the edge of the couch, the contract still in my hands. I reread it, hoping there was some mistake, a misunderstanding that could explain everything. But the truth was there in black and white. Sarah had chosen her family's house over our future. And in doing so, she'd destroyed us. That night, sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the guilt, the tears, the excuses. I replayed every conversation we'd ever had, searching for the moment it had all gone wrong. I didn't know how I'd missed it, how I'd missed her. It felt like I'd been living with a stranger. Worse, it felt like I didn't know myself anymore. How had I let this happen? The house, which had always been a source of comfort, now felt foreign. I wandered through the rooms, noting every corner she'd touched, every piece of herself she'd left behind. I hated it. I hated her for what she'd done. But more than that, I hated myself for letting her in to begin with. By morning, I knew one thing for certain: the house would never feel the same again. The next morning, I wasted no time. I knew that Sarah's betrayal wasn't just emotional, it had legal consequences. I needed to protect myself before things spiraled further. The contract she signed without my consent haunted me, every word felt like a ticking bomb waiting to detonate. By mid-morning, I was sitting across from my lawyer, a sharp and calculated man named Harris, who'd handled my family's affairs for years. Harris studied the papers I handed him with an expression so cold it could freeze a river. "She forged your signature," he said simply, the words carrying an edge of disgust. "This is fraud. You have every right to press charges, but first, we need to make sure she hasn't done more damage." That's what I feared the most, the unknown. Sarah had been living with me for 2 years. 2 years of shared finances, shared accounts, and shared access. How far had she gone? What else had she taken? My stomach turned at the thought of finding out. Harris promised to get to the bottom of it. He would block any sale attempts, report the forgery, and look into any other irregularities. For the first time since I opened that envelope, I felt a sliver of control return to me. But Sarah wasn't finished. That much became clear by the end of the week. It started as whispers, friends avoiding my calls, vague text messages that read like someone trying to be polite but distant. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the paranoia of someone who'd been betrayed. But the truth surfaced soon enough. One of my oldest friends, Mark, finally let it slip during a strained phone call. "She's saying some pretty serious stuff about you, man," Mark admitted, hesitating like he didn't want to say more. "She told everyone you kicked her out with no explanation. That you were abusive, controlling. She's playing the victim." I hung up the phone in a haze, my pulse thundering in my ears. Sarah had beaten me to the narrative. She'd taken everything that happened and twisted it into a grotesque story where I was the villain, the monster who'd ruined her life. The shock of it hit harder than the first betrayal. I wanted to scream, to explain, to set the record straight, but how? Sarah was smart. She knew our friends, their soft spots, their sympathies. She knew how to weave a story that would paint her as the heartbroken woman tossed aside without reason. The anger that burned inside me was different now. It wasn't the raw, wild rage I'd felt that night when I confronted her. This was colder, more controlled. I had trusted her with my home, my heart, and my future, and now she was stealing my reputation too. I refused to let her win. I wouldn't let her lies become my truth. By the time I returned to Harris's office a few days later, I was ready to fight. "We need to do more," I told him. "She's spreading lies about me. She's trying to ruin my life." Harris leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "Defamation is a slippery slope," he said. "But if she's telling lies that damage your reputation, we have options. You need evidence. Screenshots of messages. Witnesses who can confirm what she's saying. Without proof, it's your word against hers." The fight was no longer just about the house, it was about everything she was trying to take from me. I spent the next week reaching out to mutual friends, trying to gauge how far her story had spread. Some were polite but distant, others avoided me entirely. Sarah had done a thorough job. The worst part? I could tell some of them believed her. That realization stung more than I cared to admit. Through it all, I stayed focused on the legal battle. Harris reassured me that we had a strong case. "The contract will be voided," he said firmly. "Forgery is a crime, and we'll make sure the buyer knows the truth. Sarah won't see a dime from this." That was some comfort, but it wasn't enough. I wanted her lies to stop. Late one night, as I scrolled through social media, I stumbled across one of Sarah's posts. It was a photo of her, sitting on a moving box with a forlorn expression, her caption carefully worded to tug at heartstrings. "Starting over is never easy, especially when you trusted someone so much." The comments were flooded with support. Friends I'd known for years were comforting her, saying things like, "You're so strong," and "He never deserved you." I wanted to throw my phone across the room. Instead, I took screenshots. Proof. Harris's words echoed in my mind, "You need evidence." I started gathering everything I could, texts, posts, messages from friends who'd heard her lies firsthand. It felt dirty, like I was wading through sewage, but it had to be done. I wouldn't let her destroy my life without a fight. Some nights, the anger kept me awake, staring at the ceiling as I replayed every moment of our relationship. I'd loved Sarah. I'd trusted her. And now, she was showing me who she truly was, someone who would lie, manipulate, and destroy anyone in her path to get what she wanted. The house felt emptier than ever. Its walls, once filled with laughter and love, were now a reminder of everything I'd lost. But I refused to let it become a tomb. Sarah had tried to take my home, my trust, and my reputation, but she wouldn't succeed. As the days passed, I focused on building my case and reclaiming control. I wasn't the villain Sarah wanted the world to believe I was. The truth was on my side, and soon enough, everyone would see it. I thought things had finally settled into a bitter, uneasy calm. My lawyer, Harris, had taken control of the legal chaos surrounding the forged documents, and I'd started piecing my life back together, one slow, frustrating day at a time. But Sarah wasn't done with me, not by a long shot. It was 2 a.m. when the motion sensors triggered. A loud ping on my phone jolted me awake, the screen lighting up with an alert from the security system. I blinked at the notification, "Camera 3, front door, activity detected." My heart pounded as I sat up and swiped to open the live feed. What I saw on the screen made my blood run cold. There, crouched by my front door, was Sarah. Beside her, hunched over like some shadowy accomplice, was her father. They were fiddling with the lock, trying to force their way inside. For a moment, disbelief paralyzed me. I watched as Sarah gestured wildly at her father, her face twisted with urgency. He moved with clumsy desperation, clearly unused to such things, but determined nonetheless. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it didn't matter, the image alone was damning. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an accidental visit. This was deliberate. I grabbed my phone, adrenaline flooding every nerve in my body. My voice shook as I called the police, relaying the situation as calmly as I could. I half expected the dispatcher not to believe me, my ex-fiancée and her father are breaking into my house, sounded more like the plot of a bad thriller than real life, but she assured me officers were on their way. The minutes that followed felt like hours. I kept my eyes glued to the screen, watching as Sarah and her father struggled with the lock. I knew it wouldn't hold forever. The thought of them actually getting inside made my skin crawl. What were they trying to take? My documents? Valuables? Evidence that could further incriminate her? The possibilities were endless and horrifying. The wail of police sirens cut through the night air like a knife. Sarah's head snapped up in panic. Her father stumbled back, his hands raised as though surrendering to some unseen force. The flashing red and blue lights filled the camera feed, illuminating their guilty faces. I didn't move from my spot until I saw two officers step into frame, weapons drawn, ordering them to the ground. By the time the officers knocked on my door, Sarah and her father were already in cuffs, sitting miserably on the front lawn. I opened the door, my pulse still racing as I greeted the police. The lead officer, a no-nonsense woman with a stern face, gave me a brief summary. Caught them red-handed, sir. We'll charge them with attempted illegal entry, at the very least. If you want to press additional charges, we'll need your statement. I nodded, still numb. I wanted to ask Sarah why. I wanted to demand answers. But I knew better. Any interaction would only give her a chance to twist the story again. I watched as they loaded her and her father into the back of the squad car. Sarah's eyes met mine for the briefest moment, and in them, I saw something strange, a mix of hatred and desperation. Then she was gone, the car pulling away into the dark. For the next few days, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Mutual friends, neighbors, and even distant acquaintances had heard about Sarah's arrest. Most were curious, others just nosy, but their questions all circled the same thing: what happened? I kept my answers short and factual, resisting the urge to pour fuel on the fire of gossip. Sarah had already shown how far she was willing to go. I wouldn't stoop to her level. But then, just when I thought I'd finally seen the worst of her games, she called me. The number flashed on my screen, and instinctively, I almost let it go to voicemail. But curiosity got the better of me. I answered, my voice sharp and guarded. Before I could say anything, her voice cracked through the line, tearful and trembling. I'm pregnant. It's yours. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. My thoughts reeled, colliding with each other like a car crash. Pregnant? Mine? It didn't make any sense. The timing, the situation, nothing about it felt real. And yet, her voice was so convincing, so broken, that a flicker of doubt wormed its way into my mind. You're lying, I finally managed to say, my voice barely more than a whisper. She swore up and down that it was true, repeating the lie like a mantra. She claimed she'd found out only recently, that the stress of everything had kept her from telling me sooner. But her words were hollow. Deep down, I knew this was just another manipulation, another desperate attempt to claw her way back into my life. After everything she'd done, she wanted me to pity her. She wanted me to second-guess myself, to question the decisions I'd made. I hung up on her, my hands shaking with anger. For hours, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if she told people? What if she spread this lie to mutual friends or online? The thought made my stomach turn. Sarah had already shown she was capable of forging documents, spreading rumors, and even breaking into my house. What was stopping her from using a fake pregnancy to ruin me further? Sarah's phone call haunted me for days. I couldn't stop replaying her words, I'm pregnant. It's yours, it was the kind of claim designed to rip a man apart, to wedge a seed of doubt deep enough that it would sprout into panic. I refused to let her win, but something in me needed to be sure. As much as I knew she was capable of manipulation, I couldn't shake the thought, what if? I called Harris and explained the situation. He listened without interrupting, though I could hear the faint sigh of exasperation on the other end. When I finished, his voice was calm, steady, a lifeline amidst my spiraling thoughts. "Demand proof," he said. "If she's telling the truth, she'll provide medical evidence. If not, well, we both know what the answer will be." That was all I needed to hear. I texted Sarah, my message cold and direct. I demanded a doctor's confirmation, medical paperwork, a scan, anything to back up her claim. Her reply came hours later, short and clipped, "You'll get it soon." It was the kind of response that reeked of someone stalling for time. My gut told me she was lying, but I wouldn't leave room for doubt. Days passed without any sign of the evidence she'd promised. My patience thinned, and my anger grew. I wanted to expose her lies, to rip apart whatever false narrative she thought she could spin. But Sarah had other plans, ones that involved dragging her family back into the mess. A letter arrived at my door one morning, thick and official-looking. My stomach dropped as I tore it open. Inside was a legal notice. Sarah's family was threatening to sue me for emotional distress and unfair eviction. They claimed that I'd kicked Sarah out of the house without cause, leaving her homeless, destitute, and in severe emotional turmoil. They even added a ludicrous demand for compensation for the time she'd spent living in the house, as though she'd been a tenant, not my fiancée. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. After everything Sarah had done, forging my signature, spreading lies, breaking into my house, her family had the nerve to position themselves as victims? I read the letter twice, feeling the anger swell until it became something sharper, something colder. I didn't hesitate. I forwarded the letter to Harris, who called me within minutes. He was practically seething. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice steely. "They're trying to intimidate you, plain and simple. But they've walked straight into a trap. If they want a fight, we'll give them one." Harris drafted a response so sharp it could cut glass. He outlined every one of Sarah's actions, the forgery, the rumors, the attempted break-in. He made it clear that we had evidence to back up every claim, including police reports and security footage. Then he laid out a threat of our own, a countersuit for defamation, harassment, and damages caused by her illegal actions. "Send this to them," Harris instructed. "Let them know we're not backing down." I didn't need convincing. Sarah and her family had underestimated me. They thought they could wear me down, bully me into silence, but they were wrong. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd fight back with the truth. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. I kept waiting for Sarah's next move, for another phone call or some desperate plea. Instead, the silence dragged on, each day stretching longer than the last. I almost convinced myself that Harris's response had scared her off, until I checked my email one morning. There it was. An attachment labeled "Proof." For a brief moment, doubt flickered through me again. I opened the file, my hands trembling with anger and anticipation. The attachment was a grainy image of an ultrasound, a scan with no name, no date, no identifying details. It was laughable. Sarah hadn't even tried to make it convincing. I forwarded it to Harris immediately, and he confirmed what I already knew. "This isn't proof," he said flatly. "It's a cheap tactic. She's grasping at straws." That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the darkened screen of my laptop. The weight of everything pressed down on me. Sarah had tried to take my house, my reputation, and now she was dragging her own family into the fight. Each step she took was more desperate than the last, but it didn't make it any easier to stomach. I felt like I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, one where the person I'd loved most had become my greatest enemy. But as I sat there, something shifted. The anger that had consumed me for weeks settled into something steadier, something more resolute. Sarah's lies were unraveling, piece by piece, and I would make sure the truth came to light. I wouldn't let her win. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, Harris filed the countersuit. It was official now, a battle neither of us could walk away from. Sarah had started this war, but I would be the one to finish it. The silence stretched for days after Harris filed the countersuit. It was as if Sarah and her family had vanished into thin air. The calls stopped, the rumors faded, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't trust the calm at first. Part of me kept waiting for another blow, another scheme, but nothing came. The absence of chaos was unsettling at first, like the quiet after a storm when you're still braced for lightning to strike. But eventually, I let my guard down. It started small. I could sleep through the night again without my phone buzzing me awake or nightmares pulling me back to Sarah's lies. I drank my coffee in silence, no longer scanning every email or text message with dread. My house, the home that had felt tainted, slowly started to feel like mine again. It was no longer haunted by memories of her. I reclaimed the spaces she'd tried to invade, rearranging furniture and throwing away the remnants of her presence. It was cathartic, a physical act of taking back control. Days turned into weeks, and it became clear, Sarah and her family were gone for good. Whether it was Harris's legal threat or their own realization that they couldn't win, I didn't know. And I didn't care. They'd retreated, leaving me standing victorious amidst the wreckage they'd tried to create. With the dust finally settled, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. It was impossible not to. The warning signs had been there all along, the red flags I'd ignored, dismissed, or explained away because I loved her. I remembered the way Sarah had always avoided conversations about finances, changing the subject or brushing off my questions with a smile. There were her subtle manipulations, the way she'd twist situations to make herself the victim whenever she wanted something. I'd chalked it up to stress, to quirks, to anything but what it really was, manipulation. Even her relationship with her parents, once so loving and charming on the surface, had always felt a little off. They treated Sarah like a fragile princess, someone to be coddled, protected, and indulged at all costs. I'd thought it was endearing at first, but in hindsight, it was another clue. Her father's willingness to break into my house with her proved how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. It wasn't love, it was entitlement. And me? I'd been blind. Naive, even. I wanted to believe in Sarah, in the person I thought she was, so badly that I ignored my instincts. Every red flag was just another piece of fabric in what I thought was a perfect tapestry. I'd loved an illusion, not the real Sarah. That realization stung, but it also freed me. I wouldn't make the same mistake again. It took time, but I started rebuilding my life. I reconnected with friends I'd pushed aside during my relationship, realizing how much I'd isolated myself without even knowing it. People I hadn't spoken to in months reached out, offering support and encouragement. Some had heard the rumors Sarah had spread, and they were glad to finally hear the truth. Others just wanted to know I was okay. I threw myself back into my old hobbies, things I'd abandoned while trying to play the role of Sarah's perfect partner. I picked up my guitar again, fingers stumbling over the strings at first but finding their rhythm with time. I dusted off my hiking boots and spent weekends out in the mountains, letting the fresh air clear my head. I even started cooking again, something Sarah had always insisted we order out instead of doing ourselves. Every small step felt like reclaiming another part of myself. The house, too, became a symbol of my new beginning. Where it had once felt like a battleground, it now felt peaceful. I stopped walking through its halls expecting to find shadows of Sarah lingering in the corners. Instead, I found comfort in the silence, in the way sunlight spilled through the windows each morning, warming the floors. This was my home, my sanctuary, and no one could take it from me again. Looking back, I realized that Sarah's betrayal had been a gift in disguise. She'd shown me who she really was before it was too late. If we'd gone through with the wedding, if I'd spent years tied to someone who could lie, cheat, and manipulate so easily, the cost would have been so much greater. I'd dodged a bullet, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. The biggest lesson I learned was this: trust and respect are the foundations of any relationship. Without them, love isn't enough. It's better to walk away from someone who doesn't value you than to cling to a lie because it's easier than facing the truth. People like Sarah don't always reveal themselves in grand, dramatic gestures. Sometimes, it's the little things: a pattern of dishonesty, a refusal to take accountability, a tendency to shift blame. If you look closely, the truth is always there, hidden in the details. I ignored it once, but I never would again. As I stood on my back porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. The chaos was over, and I'd come out stronger on the other side. I'd faced manipulation, lies, and betrayal, and I'd survived. More than that, I'd won. Sarah had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, she'd lost. She'd shown her true colors, and I'd walked away with my dignity, my home, and my future intact. That was my victory, knowing that I'd seen through the lies and taken back control of my life. As the sky turned shades of orange and purple, I smiled to myself. Life was mine to live again, and this time, I wouldn't take it for granted. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. That was all that mattered.